You don't know me, my name is Paul Hewitt, and I am the commercial partner in Marketing We Trust. That is a pre-COVID picture. As you can see, I don't quite look that young anymore. The last 2 years has done terrible things to all of us. So in terms of data-driven community, this is an event dedicated to sharing the latest thinking and knowledge about data-driven marketing. And it's an event that we've been running now for probably, I think it's about 2 years. We're coming up to the 2-year mark. And the reason why we started this event was, it was actually inspired by Google. Ben and I were in San Francisco at a Google Marketing Partner event, and there was a lot of information being passed to us as a Google certified partner, which we knew wasn't getting to the wider community in Sydney. So therefore, we wanted to bring that knowledge back to our community, not just our clients, but our peers and other people in our community. And so we set up this group with three main purposes: to share digital marketing expertise, to share some product and tool knowledge. So in the past, we have done quite a bit of quite a few seminars around specific tools like Optimize. We've done some things around Google Ads, around Google Analytics. And then also we wanted to build a community of digital marketers. So over the past couple of years, I think we've had about 1,000 people sign up and attend these events. So that's a number that we're always quite amazed with, and we're grateful for everyone for being part of that community. And it's great to see the same faces attending many of these events. So in terms of the sponsor, in Marketing We Trust, we are an enterprise digital marketing business. So we provide three types of services. The first is measurement. So we're doing everything from tag management, data analytics, data studio work. We also work on the growth side of things. So we provide our customers with large-scale SEO, search ads, Facebook, display, video campaigns, and then we work in conversion rate optimization as well. So in terms of, before I get on to an open invitation for speakers, we are going to start running these events again in Sydney. We are hoping for a December event. So all being well, we saw the roadmap for the a pathway out of lockdown yesterday from our premier here in New South Wales, and it looks like we may be able to do some events. If not in December, it will be early 2022. So we will keep everyone up to date with that, just to make sure that when we're allowed to get back in a room, we will. And when we do, we will make sure we do it in a safe way. But we're looking forward just to welcoming people back and having a few drinks and having some food with the community. So we'll keep you all posted on that. And then the next is just an open invitation. We have got plenty of great speakers over the past few years, and we want to continue that trend. So if you're seeing any speakers out there that you would like to hear from, just message me, whether it's on, you've got my email address through the invites, but even if it's on Twitter or LinkedIn, get in contact with me, point me in the direction of a speaker, and we'll organize things. So one final thing, and if you've got a moment just to do this now by typing into your browser, in Marketing We Trust Sydney, you will get the Google My Business panel on the side, or if you're on your mobile at the top, and you will be able to give us a 5-star review. I don't think I'm allowed to tell you to give us a 5-star review, but obviously it's the only one we want. And these events take a lot of planning. So Kirsty, who you can't see on the call right now, but she's IMWT host, spends a lot of time organizing speakers, getting the marketing organized, and making sure that we're collecting and sharing information about marketing tool updates as part of this community. So it'd be fantastic if you could just click on that link and give us a bit of a review. That would make Kirsty very happy. So without any further delay, I would like to introduce to you Aurelie Pols. So in a way of an introduction, I mean, Aurelie is quite a unique character because she is a French-speaking Dutch national living in Spain, but working globally in countries like US and in the APAC region as well. So very, very multinational speaker today. And I think in terms of her accolades, she has been recognized by the Digital Analytics Association as the most influential industry contributor for work in data privacy. And Aurelie is going to speak to us today about how to prepare for globally evolving privacy legislation. And in terms of how we met Aurelie, my colleague Benoit, head of analytics, who many of you have heard from on previous events, recommended her, said he came across her presentation at Super Week in Helsinki, I believe. Was it Helsinki?
In Hungary, Budapest.
In Hungary, Budapest, there we go. Ben said, you absolutely need Aurelie to talk about this topic, and here we are today. So Aurelie, thank you very much for agreeing to do this presentation to the community here today. And can I hand over to you?
Sure. So thank you very much, Paul, for the introduction, and certainly Kirsty and Ben for having me. So let me see if I can just hit the green button and then go over to the presentation. So good morning from Madrid. I hope you can all see my screen. So indeed, we met in Hungary. I understand Ben is based in Vietnam. I am in Madrid, and this is about a presentation about how privacy is evolving globally. To have a conversation about how we can continue to do our jobs and ideally reach out to prospects and customers through our marketing messages, but making sure that we kind of find the right balance with all these legislations that are kind of moving ahead. Certainly here in Europe, with the GDPR that was enforced in 2018 and continues to create ripple effects, which I'm going to talk about, and talk a bit about APAC region as well, while noticing what the US is doing. So I do different things. I'm a special character in the sense that my background is in econometrics. I love data, I really do. And when I talk to lawyers, I always say I'm a recovering dataholic, but I still love data a lot. But I also started to understand how legislation works. This is what I want to share a bit with you so that we can build bridges between these worlds and make sure that we can continue doing our business, supporting our prospects and our customers, our business as well, but also making sure that everybody feels good about what's going on and how the data is being shared. So I have about 30 minutes. I'll try not to go too much overboard, but I'm really happy to take questions as well at the end that we'll hopefully discuss also together with Paul. But I really wanted to talk a bit about where we are in terms of privacy, or as we call it, data protection in Europe. Certainly positioning this in where it comes from, where we're going, and where we are today. Talk a bit about cookies, because everybody cares about cookies a lot, certainly in our industry. Comparing what's going on, certainly in the APAC region, Australia, with what we do here in Europe, and then give you some ideas of how to think about it and how to prepare moving forward. So I hope this will be interesting to you, so let's dive in. But before we do that, there are often a lot of things that are being shared around data protection and privacy that might need to be revisited So I took the liberty of going for this wonderful little tool in this movie where you look at the white light and it flashes inside your eyes, and then you forget about a couple of notions that are rather complicated, need to be rediscussed. But just to kind of change a bit your mindset, I think this is also why Ben called me in, is I think differently when it comes to privacy because I'm not a lawyer. And I'd like you to think a bit or forget about three topics that come back again and again in probably a very strange way of thinking about certainly data, is this idea of data ownership, who owns data. The fact that we talk so much about consent, it's always about consent, and there's probably a bit more than just consent. And also that what I noticed is when there are press releases or when privacy is in the news, we always talk about the watchdogs when we talk about supervisory authorities. And well, my idea is that with respect to these three topics, we might think about it a bit differently. Instead of thinking about data ownership, we might think about autonomy of individuals, maybe their dignity as we go towards more datafied societies. Not just think about consent, but maybe think about also the possibility that there's something else, and we call it lawful basis for data processing. And then these watchdogs, they don't have to be Dobermans. Maybe these people are institutions where we could exercise our rights as consumers, as customers, as data subjects, to make sure that as we move towards more digitalized services within our societies, well, there's a right balance between what businesses do, public authorities do, and what we can do as individuals within a well-functioning and ideally democratic society. Democracy being what it is, it's not perfect, but it's the best we have for the moment. So why am I saying that while also proposing that you have maybe a cookie? Is first of all, personal data or personal information is not the same thing as your car, your house, when we talk about ownership. I can sell my car, but I can't replicate it. So that's very specific. It's this idea that data can actually be replicated or transferable without actually losing any kind of value. Well, it does lose a bit of value through time, but that's another conversation. So when we think about data, is it really a property? Is it really a commodity that is for sale and to sell and buy is kind of a question we need to ask. And if you're interested about in the topic and want to broaden your mind, there's these discussions about the tragedy of the commons, where people used to put all their cattle together, and then we started enclosing the properties, the lands, and this had consequences. So it's a bit the same thing we're revisiting today. This idea of property and data, should we really think it's in these terms? I'm not saying it's not the case. I'm just saying, think about this. Does this make sense? The second point I wanted to share with you is this idea that consent is maybe not the only way forward. I see it a lot, and certainly in more Anglo-Saxon countries, Australia included, but is it really the best way to think about using personal data? Because it puts the burden on the consumer, on the user all the time. It's like, you have to accept this. And then the last bit I wanted to talk about also as well is to say, well, those watchdogs, those authorities that are there, they're not going to knock on your door from one day to the other and then present you with a huge fine of 20 million euros or 40 million euros. It doesn't work that way. There are mechanisms that have been built into legislation through time to make sure that, well, there are conversations about how data is being used. So these kind of three things I want you to think about: data ownership, consent, and watchdogs, to kind of rebuild your neural network, your mindset around privacy, and think about how we can move forward. A next then example that I wanted to share, because there's really a lot of focus on consent, is one of the reasons why burden should potentially not be put onto users is that often these notices are actually rather vague. And the problem is it's not only vague for the user. When I read this example of an app that would like to share some data with other apps in order to improve and spread the word, it also actually is increasingly vague for engineers, because what happens here is what we're going to do is that we're going to collect consent here through this notice. But do you actually understand what this means in terms of data flows? Is this rather clear for the engineers to say, oh, I'll pass that data to that other system if I have consent, but not that one? So this is where we need to get a bit better when we indeed use consent to make sure that the customer, the prospect, understands what we're going to do with the data. We align these expectations also with the data flows, and that the engineers behind that also understand, well, how can I push that data, or where should I stop that data being pushed through to certain systems? So consent is interesting. It's there. It's certainly a tool to be used, but it's not like the 100% solution to everything. And it does require some thinking and some collaborative thinking around it as well. So I want to talk a bit about the state of where we are today. So this is a rather, I think, clear map of privacy legislations. I just finished training at mParticle, also around privacy, where we noticed that there were 145 privacy legislation that were passed on a global level. This is the map of it. We're actually at 147 now. So I keep count to have an idea of who is passing what kind of legislation, what this means for our customers. I think what's interesting in this map is that there is one big country that is still there in rather a very light color. And you might have heard about certain legislations being passed per US states, so Vermont, California, Colorado. And it's true, different bills are being pushed, but we are still waiting for the United States to have a federal privacy legislation. So this gives you an idea of where we're going. Obviously, one of the biggest ripple effects that happened, certainly as of 2016 and then 2018, was Europe's GDPR. And from there, we have seen an acceleration. As I said, 147 countries now have privacy legislation being enforced. How this is being enforced by supervisory authorities still depends on each country. So Europe is kind of getting its act together with the European Data Protection Board. But it does mean that if you look at countries like, for example, Canada, or you look at Australia, or you look at South Africa, they all have their own watchdogs, as we often call them, but these supervisory authorities that have certain powers to then enforce these kinds of legislation. So this is always a bit different. It doesn't evolve in the same way. And we certainly see this in Europe as well. The French push certain things a lot more than, for example, the Finns, who care maybe a bit more about certain sectors. But this gives you an idea of where are we going in terms of privacy legislation. It's not a movement that just stopped in 2018 because Europe pushed the GDPR. It's actually creating ripple effects across the world, and where the GDPR is kind of seen as a blueprint to move forward in this idea of giving users, customers, data subjects rights around their data. Where did we come from? Where were we yesterday? Well, actually, to be honest, the US played a very important role in all these conversations. And it actually started at the turn of the previous last century, around 1890, where a judge in the US wrote, for the first time, Louis Brandeis wrote about the right to privacy. In 1974 as well, the US pushed for the Privacy Act, and inside that Privacy Act were a bunch of privacy principles called the FIPS, which are still the basis for a lot of legislation around the world that is today influencing the way that countries, governments are passing legislation and creating authorities to support this right to privacy. So it's not as if the US is totally ignorant around this. It's just that they have played a role certainly in the past, and that we are now looking at how they will ideally push some form of a federal privacy legislation, because state level legislation is making things slightly more complicated than it should. Europe on its end pushed, as you know, the GDPR back in 2018 in terms of enforcement. It wasn't new either. It came from the Data Protection Directive of 1995. So this is always about evolution. It's not a revolution, it's something that evolves slowly but surely, and ideally it should evolve in a global manner. The question then is, what happens tomorrow? Where are we going to go, knowing that, well, these crazy Europeans passed some stuff? And there was an interesting article written by somebody I respect very much, who is called Cory Doctorow. I shared the link here. It was published a couple of days ago. That talks about, well, US federal legislation that is needed. He also talks about competition, because these privacy and competition are kind of getting together. Now, what Cory says is that the big internet companies should have legal limits for the use and handling of personal data. And we should have in the United States a federal national privacy law with private right of action. And so that we can make sure that, you know, this balance between the rights of individuals to have a dignified life and live in all autonomy as we use more data to manage their lives is balanced with, well, the potentiality for business to actually make money. And it's interesting that he talks about this private right of action, because it's something that actually already exists within the GDPR and is currently being tested out in the courts. So what happens is that the GDPR pushes for a legislation that then is being tested out on the markets, and where, well, lawsuits are being brought forward, where the courts have to decide whether it's applicable or not. So it's not as if when a law is enforced, suddenly everything changes. When a law is enforced, well, everybody starts to adapt, ideally before the enforcement of the law. This is why the GDPR had 2 years to do that. But also there's still a lot of things being tested out within the courts to see how this is going to work. And one of these examples of this private right to action is, for example, you might have heard about the invalidation of Privacy Shield last summer in 2020 by somebody called Max Schrems, is actually the exercise of Article 80 of the GDPR, the representation of data subjects by not-for-profit organizations. And so there's a bunch of these remedies within the GDPR that today are being tested out in front of the courts to see if it will actually work. And so it's really about trying to create legislation, trying to build up authorities that are going to be a centralizing point for data subjects, for consumers to say, hey, I have a problem with this. And then to make the judicial system do its work as well, enforcing what's inside there. So I think tomorrow we'll have more and more of these tests in front of the courts, which also means that risk for companies is going to evolve in the sense that, well, people can complain more, and these authorities are going to play their roles in making sure that the rights of data subjects are going to be abided by. We've been through this with civil rights, for example, before. So it's nothing new is just an evolution of the markets as we use more data to optimize our business one way or another. What we also often forget is that as the courts are testing out stuff and see if this actually sticks and works, is that inside the GDPR, there are certain powers for the supervisory authorities, the French, the Finns, the Dutch, the Belgians, the Spaniards, where they can actually quite harm businesses in a very significant way. And well, we often talk about the fines to say, oh my God, it's going to be from 2 to 4% of global turnover or up to 20 million euros, whichever is higher. The supervisory authorities can damage businesses in a far greater manner than just these fines. So I don't want to say that, oh, it's just money, so nobody cares. But when you read, for example, the power that the supervisory authority has in Europe, you realize that if you read Article 58, that they can actually limit processing. They can ask for processing not to take place anymore. And this is a challenge for example, Facebook, that might have to stop processing data between Europe and the United States. So this is also in front of the court. Supervisory authorities can also ask companies to delete data or to restrict the processing of data. And as digitalization of our societies is based on scale, we have a lot of data. Imagine if, a big international corporation was actually asked to start deleting data inside their systems and trying to find that specific piece of data that they need to delete. So this is huge costs that companies could face if they are not careful with the way that they're actually processing the personal data. The last one, as I work also a lot with compliance teams, and a lot of companies go after certifications to prove that they are as compliant as possible with privacy legislation. There's no GDPR compliance scheme out there yet recognized by the European Commission, but a supervisory authority could actually also withdraw a certification. So if you understand how much time it takes to go through ISO requirements, SOC 2s, and these kinds of certifications, it's also suddenly a risk that is rather different from the fines we always talk about. So in a sense, tomorrow is already there, the law is there, the supervisory authorities are gearing up, and everybody's trying to align to make sure that we find the right balance while we take advantage of the data that we're collecting to improve our societies, but in a balanced way. So going back to what I want you to think about and change your mindset is really think about this idea of fundamental rights when it comes to data that is probably yours or the company that collects it, but it's not a property as such. It's really about your autonomy, about your dignity, about how we're going to live our lives moving forward. It's really about this idea that yes, consent, but maybe not only. When you share data between systems, whether you're in healthcare or you're in travel industries, there's a reason why you're sharing data between entities and your systems. You might want to not ask for consent to a patient who is almost dying on its hospital bed and accept that, well, there might be a reason to process data for the vital interest of the patient. So consent is one way to think about it, but not the only way to think about how we process data. And in the end, it's about teams getting together to be accountable. And this is what I want to share with you today. But I was also always tell, certainly data scientists, is you don't have to read the GDPR, but maybe you want to read the Charter of Fundamental Rights to understand, as we also talk a lot about ethics, understand what kind of values you need to keep in mind when you are processing data that might be personal or not. So I really strongly recommend reading the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union. It's 53 articles. It's kind of straightforward, but it's a good basis if your company is thinking about ethical policies in terms of processing data as we move forward. So as I mentioned, I suggested cookies before through the Oracle and Matrix. There's a lot of discussions about cookies, and there were also a lot of discussions around Apple's initiative for the app transparency framework following last summer. And actually, I was in the room of the European Parliament back in October of 2018, when Tim Cook stood up and said, we at Apple, we recognize privacy as a fundamental right. It seems like rather obvious for certain European people. It's not that obvious for one of the biggest US-based companies in the world. And so the fact that Tim Cook stood up there to say, we recognize privacy as a fundamental right, also meant that, well, they're probably going to take the GDPR rather seriously. And personally, I think that this is where all this discussion around certainly IDFA and ATT came from. Because when you think of how these identifiers are being collected from a European legislative standpoint, actually Apple creates this identifier, the IDFA. It comes with your phone. It's set by Apple. And they have an obligation on the GDPR to actually ask for consent. So when I saw ATT come up, I was like, well, that's kind of obvious. They're aligning with the GDPR, and Google, I have no doubt, will have to do the same thing for Android. But it does get back to this idea that what did happen with the GDPR is that it broadened the scope of applicability of the law. The fact that suddenly there was no discussion anymore about the fact that cookies, IP addresses, unique identifiers are personal data and fall under the scope of the law. It wasn't the case before. So I get this question very often is, you know, what falls under the GDPR, what falls under privacy legislation? And certainly before the GDPR, we tended to say, well, you know, it's just cookies, or it's just IP addresses, or it's just, you know, any kind of identifier. You can't uniquely identify an individual with this, so there's no problem. With the GDPR, this changed. So cookies are part of the GDPR. They are mentioned in Restore 30, IP addresses as well. There's a long story about this actually in the courts. It actually goes further because there is this specific law called also e-privacy. You might have heard about why we have these little banners here in Europe. And e-privacy is actually broader than GDPR. It's about electronic communication. So I still see people in the digital analytics industry tell me, oh, but already this is not personal data. Why should we care about e-privacy or GDPR? Well, because e-privacy is actually broader than GDPR, so it does apply. So it's interesting to see how Apple has positioned itself with respect to ATT. They have tried to align with e-privacy and GDPR, but they did it in like one foot in Europe and one foot in the United States, in the sense that there's still stuff that's kind of lacking in there. It's a step forward. Is it perfect when it comes to how we think about personal data under the GDPR? No, but it's certainly moving forward. And this is what we want. We want people to advance, to think about responsible uses of data under growing privacy concerns. So how should you think about personal data? Well, I still see a lot of engineers talk about PII, personally identifiable information. I consider this an obsolete term. So what I did also at Particle is we started listing where this is mentioned, and we're starting to rewrite because we want people to think about it differently. We want people to start thinking about personal data, personal information, if you want to use that term as well. It's inside the California Privacy Protection Act. Usually APAC talks about personal information as well. But the big difference is that PII are single variables. They are lists of single variables. Email is PII. My name, my first name, my last name, my address, and things like that. Personal data or personal information is about a combination of variables. This is where we enter the era of big data. This is where we recognize that we can mix data together. So it's really important to start thinking and moving away from this idea of, no, privacy laws don't apply to us because it's not personal data or personal information. It is. We have obligations. So now let's step up. Let's move forward and stop these conversations about, no, we don't have to do anything about privacy. We do. So let's try to figure out and work together to see how we can actually do this. I mentioned it a couple of times. What is the GDPR? A lot of people ask me, is it the perfect privacy legislation? No, of course not. This is a global movement and we need to work together. I see it as a blueprint that has created ripple effects. It is based on US legislation, the Fair Information Practice Principles of 1974. So it wasn't born yesterday. It took a lot of time to get there. But what it does is it empowers authorities, it empowers people to make sure that we go in the right direction, in a balanced direction with respect to the uses of data. And this is what we need to think about. This is how we need to move forward on a global level. So you might ask about, after all this rumbling of over half an hour, what about Australia? Well, you're not too late on the ball. So the Privacy Act was published in 1988. It was revised a couple of times. There are privacy principles, there are guidelines. Having said that, it's still a mix of federal, state, and territory laws, which doesn't always make it that easy to navigate. It is probably less stringent, I think, than the GDPR. And I think also the authorities in Australia probably have less power than the authorities in Europe. But it is going in the right direction, and they are certainly part of the global conversation around privacy and also competition. Certainly when I hear about the latest decisions around ownership and newspapers and things like that. Is this an easy conversation to have, and where are we going globally? There are things, as I mentioned before, I want you to think a bit differently when it comes to certain concepts inside the legislation for privacy. So I talked about the fact that consent is not everything. Unfortunately, within Australia, consent is still very, very much favored as an instrument to enforce some form of a privacy right, which is kind of complicated. There are bits and pieces also that are kind of missing in Australian legislation. So, for example, employees are not covered under any form of privacy legislation. They are in the GDPR. They are also exempted, so they're not covered either in US legislation, to be honest. So it makes, for example, types of data like trade union memberships interesting conversations to have, and we'll have to look at this in the future. But on the other hand, for example, public institutions do fall under privacy legislation in Australia. So it's kind of a mixed bag. There's no private right to action, but there are criminal penalties and personal liability. So people can be liable personally under Australian legislation, but it would depend also on how much the authorities actually enforce. So it's kind of a strange mix when you think about it. And to be honest, it kind of gets more complicated when you look at it from an APAC perspective. So there are bits and pieces there in Australian legislation that makes probably risk for companies slightly higher than before. But in terms of enforcement, we're not there yet. And when I look at it from an Asian perspective, and there are services being built today that kind of compare different legislation with respect to what's in there. And so you can actually buy these kinds of lists and take a look at it. You see that this idea that there's more to processing data than just consent So the lawful basis of this can be found within South Korean legislation and also, for example, in China, but not in Singapore. So they are also very much focused on consent. Employee data is covered in South Korea and Singapore, surely, but not in other countries. And then when it comes to risk, well, we see that Hong Kong, South Korea, and Singapore have all three. They have a private right to action, criminal penalties, and personal liability. So this makes risk rather important as well. But again, it will depend on how much power and how much budgets the supervisory authority have to bring cases in front of the courts. So it's a complicated mechanism, and it's an interesting evolution of how we're seeing privacy evolve in the past, certainly 4 years since the enforcement of the GDPR. This morning, somebody sent me also an interesting blog post. It was Future of Privacy Forum, because I asked for it, where they actually talk about APAC. And I'm sharing this so that you can read it as well. It was sent to me last night, but the summary of this workshop that took place a couple of weeks ago is that we do recognize inside APAC that the role of consent should be brought back maybe to its rightful place. And think about what I talked about before, is this idea of where does this come from in terms of the regulatory ecosystem, so that there might be more than just consent. But APAC, I think, generally speaking, is still trying to figure it out. Are we all rowing in the same direction? I think we are. I think we went through this kind of pendulum of believing in technology and that it's going to save the world and it's going to solve all our issues. Potentially COVID also brought us back to some more humanity, and trying to find this kind of balance between, we need to have technology support our lives, and we need to make sure that we find the right balance with business opportunities, growth, competition, but also fundamental rights. And in the end, when you think about it, when you think about your own company, it's really about the choices your own company is going to make in light of how you perceive these risks that are evolving, and how this is actually going to influence how you're going to collect data and how you're going to use that data moving forward. So actually, it's a concept that is really very strongly brought about within the GDPR, is to say, well, privacy is a risk-based exercise. You want to use the data, but you know that when it comes to personal data or personal information, there's going to be risk and obligations related to that. So you have a spectrum of ways to deal with that. You can, on the left-hand side, ignore and do like the 3 Japanese monkeys. You don't hear evil, you don't speak evil, and you don't see evil. Or you can totally have your mind melt through this and say, I'm not collecting any kind of data anymore. When I start conversations with typically VP CMOs, the first thing I tell them is, well, if you want zero risk, don't collect any data and you're done. And now you want to collect as much data as possible. So we need to find a balance between what you're going to do, how it's going to support your business, and the fundamental rights. And the important part of this is also to make sure that somebody is responsible, that you designate somebody that is going to make the decisions. The person in charge of setting up Google Analytics or in charge of tagging a website is not the person that's going to make those decisions. They are part of a team, they're part of a process, and together you bring to the table what's happening to make sure that somebody makes a decision about the risk the company is willing to take. And there are maybe some basic hygiene principles we might want to think about. A couple of years back, I contacted a company that was used by the CMO at the time. And I asked them for how long they were keeping the data. they said they were keeping it forever and asked me why I would ask that question. So I explained the GDPR, they're a US-based company. And they said, well, we can bring this to the engineering and product teams if you bring us legislation. So what I did is I took the French legislation, I translated it, sent it to them and said, well, they're talking about 18 months. Do you mind having data retention periods for 18 months? Lo and behold, 3 weeks later, the data retention period was limited to 18 months. And as, for example, we all hopped on Zoom here today, we also noticed Zoom is changing. There are new features. When we ask, for example, when we push the record button for this webinar, we suddenly get a prompt to give our consent. Is it perfect? No, but it is changing. So there are certain ways to think about data, like maybe not keeping it forever because deleting data is very expensive. Maybe also thinking about why am I using this data, and is this aligned with the expectations of the users? And then there's a term that the privacy folks really like, is risk mitigating measures. And they're going to ask you, if you have meetings with them, they're going to ask you what your risk mitigating measures are. And I would suggest you start with telling them that you're not keeping the data forever, and proving to them how you're going to delete data. Maybe talk a bit about purpose, but certainly about opt-out, certainly when it comes to Australia. These are some tips to start having a conversation with legal counsel when they might come to the table as well. What will legal counsel typically ask you for? They will first of all ask you for what type of data are you using. So there are different types of categories of data that influence risk. Anonymous data obviously has no risk because it's anonymous. It's good to be able to prove it's anonymous. Just don't say just like out of the blue that your data is anonymous. If legal counsel will ask you, oh, prove it to me. So explain to them why you think it's anonymous. On the other range of high risk is what's called sensitive data or special categories of data. I've listed them here. They're not exactly the same, but as we talk more and more about dignity and autonomy inside our societies, we start understanding that maybe, well, your race, maybe your sexual preferences, certainly your health data is something that is important and has higher risk. So typically when you're dealing with these kinds of types of data, sensitive or special categories, you have more obligations. The next question legal counsel typically asks is, where are the people who this data pertains to? Where are they based? Where do they reside? Because this will have consequences on how the data can be processed. And then often it goes down to, okay, so you're collecting that data, let's figure out what we have to do. What are you going to do with that data, and what do customers expect? These are like the 3 initial questions you need to prepare for when you are talking to legal counsel to understand what you need to do. So as I mentioned before, consent, be specific about what you want to do with the data. If you bring this to legal counsel, they're going to tear it apart like I did in this example. They don't understand what this actually means. And to be honest, me as a customer, I don't either. So don't trust that company. So it's really going to be about working together, making sure we build bridges between these legal specialists that are specialized in privacy, and then us as technicians, data scientists, to make sure we find the right balance in terms of risk and find the risk mitigating measures. So working together is trying to define what the obligations are. Do we need to ask for consent? Do we need to define what the purpose is? How do we assure, certainly since last summer, that international transfers are lawful? If you're an Australian company or based in APAC and you address the European market, what does that mean? What I often hear is, oh, let's just store the data in Australia and everything's going to be fine. Yes, well, it depends on the fundamental rights of the individual, certainly if you're addressing the European market. So localization or putting your data storage in a certain country is not the only magic bullet. More needs to be done. And then the third point is, what are you going to do with the data? So it's interesting to see that, for example, Australian legislation talks about the primary purpose of data. It talks a lot about this idea of not creeping out individuals. I think this is what we should ask ourselves is, okay, what am I going to do with the data? How am I going to share this, maybe between other entities? And is this what our prospects or customers expect? From there, you work together to finish that bridge together with legal counsel, making sure that you create those risk mitigating measures in case somebody knocks on your door to say, hey, I don't agree. And then you can say, well, we did this and that, and these are the measures we applied to our data processing operations. These are the contracts that underline this. And if you're not happy with that, we can have a conversation about it. But it's really important to start building those bridges. Legal counsel is not just there for the initial contracts. People like privacy engineers are starting to step up to make sure the right features exist within the systems so that the data can be used to optimize your business, but also making sure that it respects the expectations of prospects and customers and respects in certain legislations privacy as a fundamental right. So this gives you a bit an idea of what you should be thinking about, how you should be thinking about it, how you should reach out maybe to certain departments. It doesn't always mean that they are there. It also shows that you're not the only person going to be responsible for this. And so it's really a collaborative effort within companies, but also across companies to make sure everybody aligns in terms of responsibilities, because more is coming down the road, more in terms of certainly digitalization of our societies, but also more in terms of risk for companies using data and making sure, well, we do as best as we can with what we have and working together. This is what I wanted to share with you. I hope it made sense. So let me stop here. And I went over time as usual. I'm really sorry about that.
No, thank you very much, Aurelie. That was a really interesting presentation, and it certainly feels that we're only just getting a slither of how broad this topic really is. Certainly some of my thoughts coming away from that are just the way we think around data and data privacy, because many of those things that you mentioned around the way that we think about data, I class myself as a data professional, and I still think of data in those pretty traditional ways of consent and ownership. And I've got quite a few questions around that, which we'll come on to in a moment. But also around the terms like PII, that's a term I hear every single day. So interesting to get your view on the PI and the PD terminology, and that's certainly something that we will have a conversation about after this. I can see some questions starting to come through now. So if people want to answer some questions, have some questions answered, please feel free to type them in the box and in the message box, and I will read them out. But before we do, I'm gonna pull a host privilege and ask a couple of things here around data ownership. And I've noticed recently, particularly around the conversation of cookies, there's quite an old phrase called value exchange, which I thought had disappeared, but it seems to have re-emerged in the past year or so, and maybe it just disappeared from my world. So for those people who aren't familiar, the value exchange is the conversation of if you share data, if I share my data with you, what do I get back in return, i.e. Facebook access, a bit of content on a blog, etc. when I look at that concept, which is still something that powers the internet, and how we access content, it suggests that businesses and consumers still see data as a form of currency and treat it as a form of currency. I guess I got two questions that I'd like your opinion on here, which is, do you think consumers really understand that they're using their data for currency? Is the first question. And then the second is, do you see that changing anytime in the near future?
Yeah, it's data ownership is really a sticky one, as I mentioned, because we really think in terms of commodities all the time, and it is a very specific commodity. So I think this idea that free is not really free, and that, you know, if there's no monetary exchange, you're the product, is something that people are starting to understand. It used to be, well, we're veterans of the internet, so it's like in the end of 90s, it was like everything was free and it was great and things like that. We both have teenagers. Even my kids know that nothing is free and you pay with your data. So I think we're there. Whether then it is lawful or acceptable is still under debate, and certainly in front of the courts. So when we see, for example, I think there's one of, is it the New York Times? I think that asks me every time to exchange my data for access. It is in front of the courts to, in certainly Europe, to understand whether this is lawful or not. But Europe does not want to go in the direction of data ownership and this being a market. It's also very different when you look at, for example, California Consumer Privacy Act. They have 3 different roles for the data actors. So Australia doesn't. Australia is just, you use data and that's it, but 3 different roles. So CCPA talks of businesses, service providers, and data brokers. The GDPR talks about data controllers, so that businesses basically, data processors, so typically the tools we use, which are the service providers and CCPA. And then the third one is joint controllers. You are both responsible for what you're doing, not data brokers. Europe doesn't talk about data brokers. We do not recognize that there is a market for personal data. Let's see how this pans out. It's very difficult to enforce that vision upon a capitalist society. And so this is where, you know, it's really a broad topic. But
yeah, I think thank you for that. And I think it really is interesting, because what I'm starting to see in the market, particularly in response to the change in advertising cookies, is potential further commoditization of data. So potentially it going the other way, because we're starting to see startups that are trying to bring the ownership of the data, sorry to use that term again, back to the individual. I've seen a ton of startups doing this actually, where they say you are the data subject, you are the data citizen, you own the data, and therefore anyone accessing the data, which is in a warehouse that is linked to your online wallet, you will get a royalty on access and processing of that data, which to many consumers is actually quite attractive. So yeah, it's fascinating, and it'll be really interesting to see which way it goes.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's this value exchange, and there were some US hearings also I was listening to, where they talked about how much money Facebook was making through advertising, and that you should have a part of that.
Yeah.
And it's for Europeans, it's framing this as a commodity is scary. It's scary because we think about it in terms of autonomy and dignity moving forward. So
I really like those terms, actually, the autonomy and the dignity. It kind of overlays a layer of ethics or a lens of ethics that isn't there at the moment. And interestingly, I think on the I think one of the US candidates, a guy called Andrew Yang, for the last election, I think one of his policies was actually around the use of data and taxing the use of data to pay back into a universal income for American citizens. So I believe that idea had some backing. I suspect we could talk about this thing all day. So I'm going to ask someone else's questions now. And I do have more if we have time. So first of all, Freddie was asking around the breaches of GDPR, and if any Australians companies that you know of have breached the GDPR, and have they been fined, and if so, what was the outcome of that?
So when it comes to the fines, the big difference with the GDPR is, so I mentioned the Data Protection Directive of 1995 allowed countries to fine up to €500,000 or pounds, and the countries that could do that was Spain and the UK. At the time, UK was still part of Europe. So €500,000, pounds. This went up to, in the GDPR, 2 to 4% of the global turnover, or €20 million, whichever is higher. 2 to 4% of global turnover has consequences on, well, basically your turnover on the global level. Biggest fines are probably for Amazon and WhatsApp for the moment in Ireland and in Luxembourg, in the hundreds of millions. Initially, we talked also about 50 million for Google in France, but they lawyered that out of the courts, so good for them. But we're talking about hundreds of millions now, not just $500,000. So this is a lot higher. But as I mentioned, the fines are a lot higher. Everybody talks about this. But to be honest, when you get a supervisory authority to tell you, hey, you are going to stop your data flows between Europe and the United States for Facebook, that is a game changer in terms of your business model. So it's not just the fines, it's really about how they can influence your data flows between the different systems. Australian companies being fined by European supervisory authorities is not, I think, their most important plate for the moment. So as far as I know, no. I was looking at fines or decisions by the Australian Supervisory Authority. Uber, for example, got a slap on the hand. They need to appoint somebody who's going to be responsible and start working on risk mitigating measures. So it's not so much about money. In Australia, also because the supervisory authorities have less power. And power is given by the law. So if the law is not very stringent and doesn't give power or doesn't finance supervisory authorities, not much is going to happen. The next commissioner for the ICO in the UK is actually in Australia.
All right.
So I suppose he's getting out of the country because there's not enough budget, and he's going to head up the Information Commissioner's office in the UK.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, actually, because so as I mentioned, I was in a chair position at the DMA in the UK for a number of years while the GDPR was being processed, and we were heavily involved with the lobbying of particularly the first few drafts of it, because it was draconian, the first few drafts. And this specific topic came up over and over again, which was the ICO's or the European Commission's ability to take legal action out of their legal jurisdiction against private companies, and how problematic it was. And there was a lot of debate, which I don't know how it was resolved, but there was a lot of debate around the enforceability of the extended geographical scope of the data legislation. I think that the last that I saw of that particular topic was that the European Commission and the ICO in the UK, for example, could put they could put pressure, but taking action. They could put a lot of pressure, actually, but taking direct legal action was more challenging.
Yes, yes, no, obviously, but you see the same in the US. The Cloud Act is also extraterritorial. It goes beyond the territory.
Yeah.
And this is where you can feel that basically data is power, and is powered by countries, and this is a geopolitical game, and this will continue. But our democracies are based on a certain logic, so typically the laws apply inside the country. There are things like companies have to appoint representatives, so that at least, well, if there's a problem, we can turn to them. And this is what Uber faced, certainly in Australia, is they need to appoint somebody in Australia that's going to be responsible. So this is kind of the next step. But yes, it's geopolitics 1,000%, and it's not going to go away.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that. I don't know if there's any more questions from anyone, but if not, we'll wrap up because we're running a bit over time. But I just wanted to say thank you so much for sharing your expertise on this topic. It was fascinating, and I learned something today. I'm sure everyone learned something today. And if people want to contact you, I can see you've got your link for LinkedIn. What's the best way to get in touch with you?
Yeah, LinkedIn or Twitter is, I think, the easiest way to start a conversation. I'm happy to take questions. As we mentioned, we talked about at the beginning, it's always context specific. It really depends. Yeah. So we're here to help both your company and mine, and to support the evolution of using data in a balanced way. And thank you so much for reaching out. Thank you for Ben to have conversations at Super Week in Bulgaria, to talk to people in Australia while I am based in Madrid. I think together we can figure this out, and this is what we should really do, is collaborate.
Excellent. Well, on that note, thank you very much for your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day in Madrid.
Thank you very much. Talk soon. Keep in touch. Bye.
Thank you everyone for attending. Bye.